So as we mentioned before, the symposium is to celebrate your completion of this program. We've been together for nearly 9 months now. In that time, we have covered a wide array of topics in globalization and international relations. Your journey was guided by your host teachers, your undergraduate interns, and in many cases, faculty members from the University of California, Irvine. Today we have a panel of faculty members who would like to share with you their global expectations in 2050. First of all, I would like to introduce Professor James Danziger. In addition to having served as the Dean of Undergraduate Studies, or Undergraduate Education, and Associate Dean of Social Sciences at UC Irvine, Professor Danziger has won all of the major teaching awards on our campus. He has also worked closely with our program for several years now to enrich the lives and educations of hundreds of high school students such as yourselves. Today, Professor Danziger will tell us how he expects the world will react in 2050 to an ever-dwindling supply of natural resources. So please join me in welcoming Professor James Danziger.
Well, good morning to all of you. It's a delight to be here. We've been asked to do something interesting, and that's to project what it's going to be like in 2050 and what kinds of things you should be worrying about. And as you've already heard this morning, that is a tough and challenging situation. So, projecting. It is 2050, and you high school students are now all about 50 years old. And that's the good news. I know, sounds pretty old, huh? It's good news because it means, among other things, that we've avoided an uncontrollable and deadly global pandemic. That's a good thing. A disastrous and perhaps unexpected nuclear weapons exchange, a big asteroid, or whatever it is that's your own favorite end of days scenario, how the world is going to end. So if we get to 2050, we've already done pretty well, considering all of the situations that are out there right now. So what might it be like then? Well, you're living in a smallish unit in a very large building, and your city is enclosed in a dome to protect you from the toxic atmosphere and global weirding. Your arm has embedded in it a small computer chip, and on this chip is all of your health and personal information. It also serves as your credit card. It also will warn you of any environmental hazards as you wander around. And it has a GPS device so that people can find you anywhere, as well as the government finding you anywhere. Also, good news, your genetically engineered grandchildren have recently been born, and they have all the physical and mental specs that their parents wanted. So congratulations, Grandpa and Grandma. Look at these swell kids. Exciting, scary, impossible. Futurists have a lot of fun trying to predict the world to come. And most of them, most of the time, get it wrong, unless they predict incremental change, things like they have been. There's a famous French saying, the more things change, the more they remain the same. So it is possible that the world of 2050 will look rather like our world with very little change. But in 1980, would it have seemed likely in 2013 that the Soviet Union disappeared? I don't think so. That most Africans would do all of their banking on a portable, mobile smartphone? Nope. That capitalist China would be outbidding us for goods all around the world? More about that from Duncan, one way or another later. That the EU would have expanded from 9 to, at the beginning of next month, 28 members? Probably not. And that religious extremism would motivate most of the political violence in the world. So the predictions that I mentioned right at the beginning, do I actually think they'll occur? I actually do think some of them will. but who knows? Predicting the future is tricky business. So with that, what I do want to suggest for your consideration this morning is that a key driver, and perhaps the key driver of global society in 2050 will be the competition and conflict over resources. Well, what resources? Many different ones. But in particular, let's focus on the basics: arable land and water, food, energy, critical minerals. The attempt to control and use these resources will shape our political systems and our economic systems, because those are the systems that allocate desired and usually scarce values and organize our collective behavior. Why do I think that resource conflict will be the key? Well, there's several factors that guide this prediction. First of all, world population, if we do survive to 2050, keep your fingers crossed, will probably be around 9 billion people. That's about 2 billion more than we have right now. And more of those 9 billion people will expect to live the good, middle-class, materially comfortable life that many of us share in the global north, countries like the US or Sweden or Japan. Secondly, some of the resources, like fossil fuels, are finite. There's only a certain amount of it out there. Mother Earth can give us what she has, and then it will simply run out. Third, there's many other resources that are or will become scarce, and the cost of trying to extract more of them will be extremely high. And fourth, the availability of some key resources that are necessary to sustain life, like clean water, food, will be further reduced because of climate change and environmental degradation. So I'm suggesting that these four factors will drive a set of challenges and problems for our resource base that is absolutely critical to our survival as a world. By 2050, we will have changed, in the words of Michael Clare, from an easy resource world to what he calls a hard resource world. Now, I do acknowledge technology will help us find substitutes for some of the resources that are in scarce supply, and it will create some new resources for us. Indeed, there's a lot of people who believe so strongly in technological innovation that it will always save our bacon. Maybe. Think genetically modified soy protein bacon. And even though we may find technological solutions for a lot of the issues that we're worried about, I would also suggest that often there's such negative spillover effects from our technologies that we don't expect and we have trouble managing, that the net benefits over the costs of some of those technological solutions will not be that great. Think nuclear power. So how are we going to live in this era of shrinking resources relative to demand? I suggest we will compete aggressively to try to capture a large amount of those resources that we want and we certainly think that we deserve. The problem is there's a lot of other people and a growing number of people around the world that also will want those same resources and feel just as entitled to have them. So who gets them? If we have a lot of money and power in the global system, we have an advantage in that competition. If we don't, we either suffer from enormous deprivation and inequality, Gilmore will talk about that, or we'll use whatever means necessary to get our share. So who's this we that I'm talking about anyway? Well, it could be you and your country, the US of A, and your country's government. Or it could be a lot of different identity groups all around the world that come together to try and achieve what they want. Now, these groups might look like today's nation states, but I suggest that it's quite likely by 2050 that a lot of these groups will be complex arrays of individuals who are defined by a variety of factors, like religion, ethnicity, function, region, wealth, control of knowledge. These groups will engage in shifting alliances with other groups to try to gain competitive advantage, and to do so in a brutally contentious global society. So you've got zero-sum competition. If I get it, they don't. If they get it, I don't. And that competition will become very nasty. Some weaker competitors will live in miserable conditions. Some will migrate, legally or not, to where it looks like there's better pickings. You'll hear about that later from Scipio. And some competitors will use force and violence at any level necessary and as ruthlessly as they need to in order to capture some resources. That is, there'll be many resource wars all over the globe. Some very local, some regional, and some among global power groups. Is all this possible? Well, here's a few factoids that may help persuade you that all this might happen. There's many factoids out there, some of them competing, but consider these. In 1998, the United States alone, that's us, consumed approximately 30% of the raw materials used by the entire human race in that year. Now, we're about 4.5% of the population. Many others want to consume like us. Do the math. Water. By 2025, well before 2050, 1.8 billion people will experience water scarcity, and half of the world's population, half of everybody on the globe, will be living under conditions of high water stress. Factoid. Oil. The Earth's total endowment is about 2 trillion barrels, and about half of it has been used up. So, at current consumption rates, which are going up rapidly, we could run out by 2050 or even before then. Minerals. There's lots of important ones out there. Unless you've studied chemistry and know your periodic table, you've never even heard a lot of the ones that are essential to the products that you now love and enjoy. Things like tantalum and dysprosium. These minerals are scarce, and increasingly they'll be prohibitively expensive for all of the people that want them. Food. The UN predicts a worldwide food crisis even in the current decade. And when you get a food crisis, you get riots, you get rebellions, you get chaos. We've eaten more out of the last 11 years, we've eaten more than we've produced as a global society in 6 of those years already. Lester Brown of the Earth Policy Research Center says the geopolitics of food is fast outgrowing the geopolitics of oil, the conflict over these scarce resources. So, we can frack, we can clone, we can desalinate, we can try to harness the wind, we can innovate, but it is quite possible that by 2050, we will have reached a point that some or perhaps many of the critical resources where either the marketplace excludes us or will suffer greatly. And we'll decide that we need to use force and violence to protect what we want from others. And others will certainly use force and violence to try to capture those resources themselves. It's a kind of a gloomy appraisal as a projection. It asks you, are you willing to live with a material standard of living that is far below that of your parents? Because as the global system evolves and the resources shrink, if we're going to maintain peace and coherence as a global society, that's probably what is necessary. And whether it's possible or not remains a question I hope you'll consider and perhaps we'll talk about later. A lower standard of living, substantially lower, well, I do suggest your genetically engineered grandkids will face that for sure. Thanks for your attention. Look forward to talking to you later.
Oops, sorry. Okay. Our next panelist is someone who is new to Global Connect, but he has been more than wonderful in helping present to our students. He is a lecturer in the Department of Sociology and has been a wonderful one at that for over 20 years here on this campus. He is a mentor to many students, including myself, and his knowledge, insight, and compassion are beyond compare. We thank him for his service to students not only on this campus, but in all of our site schools, and for teaching us and the students more about the topic that he will go over today about global inequality. So please help me welcome Professor Gilmore up to the microphone, and with a round of applause. Hi.
I'm glad to be here also. Allison is one of my honor students, and we just finished our honors theses this year for the sociology cohort. We had 15 wonderful year-long research projects that were done. Education is important, right? That's one of the things that we believe in. But my question might be at this particular point, what do you guys think that education means in terms of inequality? I'm going to ask you a question. Do you believe in inequality? And what do I mean? I mean, do you believe that there should be a difference in terms of what Professor Danziger was just talking about, in terms of the amount of resources that different individuals should get, and should that be based on something like education? Do we live in an educational meritocracy where we make the argument that the better the grades you get, the more you're going to succeed in life, and you're going to end up with a better car, a better house, more money, more resources, not just as an individual, but as a country or even as a particular region of the country. Do you believe in inequality? What kind of fascist am I? I mean, come on. I mean, are we really talking about the fact that 50% of the children in this world go to bed food insecure? That means they don't know if they're going to eat tomorrow. 50%. And 1 out of every 7 children in the United States go to bed food insecure. And we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. You believe in that kind of inequality? Sometimes when we start to think about inequality, what we start to do is we look at the haves and the have-nots. And we can focus on the haves by looking at the wealthiest people in our country. And sometimes, for example, I don't know if you guys have paid attention recently to the 1% discussions that have been going on. The top 1% of the population in this country owns 50% of the wealth in this country. 50%. The top 0.4% of 1%, 0.4%, own approximately 30% of the wealth. And that has been increasing over the last 50 years. Are the haves doing well? The haves are indeed doing very well. And at the same time, what do we see? We see an extraordinary number of have-nots. And as Professor Danziger pointed out to you, the have-nots in our country and throughout the world will be in competition simply looking for food and water. We have good data at this particular point that suggests something like 30% of the people, the population of the world, spend 2 hours a day, right now, looking for water and fuel. What happened if you got up in the morning and you didn't get to do your routine, but you had to go out and figure out where you were going to find the resources to manage your day? But guess what, guys? I don't think talking about the haves and have-nots is what we're talking about in terms of inequality. What I want to talk about is the middle class. I want to talk about you. Many of you are middle class, and even if you aren't, according to whatever statistical enumerator we might use, that is how much income you might have, how much education you might have, where you live in this country, 90% of Americans, 90% of Americans call themselves middle class. From those who are making $500,000 a year to those who are making less than 50, less than 40 for a family of 4, let's say. Everybody identifies as being middle class. And the question then becomes, what's happening to that middle class? Well, I'm here to tell you something that's going to be a little scary. It's disappearing. The way your parents lived, the jobs they had, the stuff they have, their houses, all of the stuff in your house is going to be harder and harder for you guys to duplicate. So, do we believe in inequality? Well, we are seeing increasing inequality. Increasing inequality, not at the very, not at the very top and at the very bottom, but also in the middle. We are seeing the loss of middle-class jobs and middle-class lifestyles to the degree that, as Professor Danziger was pointing out, to be able to replicate your life, your parents' life, in 2050 is going to be a lot more rare than it is right now. That's why you guys think about why you're going to school, right? You're going to go off and get that condo by the beach in a Beamer, or excuse me, a Mini Cooper, or whatever's a hot car, and you're going to live well, right? Well, I'm telling you right now, it is a zero sum. And that zero sum is increasingly leaving the middle class without the ability to go off and get the resources that their parents have. Why? Well, for one thing, we not only have a significant number of jobs that are leaving this country, you already know that, we call that outsourcing, and we're going to also talk about that again here. But right now what we see is that there is an increasing amount of literally inequality in terms of what you get for your education. How many of you guys think that getting a college BA, that is literally completing a 4-year degree, is going to be some insurance about you guys becoming middle class? I'm telling you, it's not probably the case. Every single one of you should be thinking about going to graduate school. Because if you don't think about going to graduate school these days, the possibility of you ending up in that upper 20, 25, 30% of the number of people in this country so that you can afford the kind of house that you might see in the neighborhoods that we live here, it's not going to be the case. Those jobs, along with all the benefits, the health benefits, the retirement benefits, the dental plan, all the other benefits that exist are leaving this country. Right now, we live in a country in 2013 where 86% of the jobs are part of something called the service sector. Only 14% of the jobs are part of manufacturing. And if you compare that to what the world looked like in 1960, 50 years ago, and then try to compare that to what the world's going to look like in 2050, all at this particular point we're trying to make a suggestion about is that those manufacturing jobs are continuing to shift out of the United States. And if that's the case, are we losing the ability for you guys to live as well as your parents? I'm not just talking about if you get an A and go to an elite college and graduate with a good degree. I'm talking about will the degrees actually translate into good jobs and resources. And what I'm arguing is that increasingly what we are finding is that the middle class is going to live less well. Now, let me tell you something interesting at the same time. All of us are still doing better in education than we used to. Back in the 1960s, I, by the way, am a child of the 1960s. I used to have a ponytail. I went to Woodstock. I know that makes me look embarrassed. That what we find at this particular point is that going to college back in the 1960s was something that a few elites do. It's still something that a significant number of it leads to, and only about 25% of people under 30 will finish a 4-year degree. 25%. 50%, excuse me, it's actually closer to 60. 58% of the people in this country have a high school degree or less. So you guys are going to be elite by going on to a college, a 4-year college, and completing that degree. The question is, what will it translate into? And here's where I want to suggest something. There's a difference between what we call the American dream and this idea of meritocracy and literally what's going to be there when you graduate. Equality of opportunity is meritocracy. And we like to think of that as the American dream. Equality of outcome is what we're seeing at this particular point, and we're making an argument that we are seeing more inequality of outcome than we ever have before in this country and throughout the world. And I guess what I'm trying to then tell you, what I'm trying to suggest to you, is not to drop out of school. I want you to double your efforts. I want you to think about graduate school as a norm.
It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Scipio. He is a professor in the School of Social Sciences. He's a professor in the political science and Chicano Latino studies. He is the chair of that department. And he's been with Global Connect for 10 years now, actually. So he's been around for a while, in a good way, actually. So, and I actually met him a few days ago at the Dean's Day, which is for us UCI students, it was a big day. And he was making burgers and hot dogs. And I must say, he makes a mean hot dog and burger. Not together, like separately, but it was very, very good. So without further ado, Professor Scipio, could you please take the...
Well, thank you very much for a generous introduction. You've always wondered how one makes a hot dog. Well, I could have shown you a couple of days ago. I realize I'm time limited, but I want to take a moment to personally thank Ellen for all she's done all these years. She puts a human face on what can be a very anonymous institution. And I hope for you, as well as the 11,500 high school students that have preceded you, she's shown you what we really wanted to show you, which is that UCI is here for you, that the University of California is here for you, and that you can be up here in a few years. And I hope that message gets through. If it has, it's because of Ellen. And on a personal level, Mazel Tov. We want to know what comes next. We know you're going to change the world again. So thank you, Ellen. You may remember when I came and talked to you, I talked about global migration. And I laid out for you sort of an argument about why states want to have their cake and eat it too, in a sense. They love the idea of things and things moving across borders, ideas moving across borders, goods and services moving across borders, but they think that all of that can happen without people also moving across borders. And I think they're wrong. I think that as all of the sort of good things in globalization from the perspective of our international governments happens, people are going to follow, because people are going to realize that their skills, their interests, their energies, their family members are in a different place, and they're going to want to follow those goods, services, ideas, etc. And I threw out some statistics, factoids I guess we're calling them today, that right now about 3% of the world's population lives in a country other than the country where they were born. In the United States, about 12% now, actually getting close to 13%. So, we live in a world of people moving really to a degree that I think we've never seen before, at least haven't seen in the period since states developed, with a sense of borders. So in the way, the question I asked you was a giveaway. I assume it's behind me. Yes, good. I asked you, will international migration be easier or more difficult for someone like you in 2050? And you might say, well, it'll be easier because there'll be more of it. And I think that's a very reasonable assumption to make. But note also that I asked you a second question, or second part of the question, and that's for someone like you. So I think to answer this question, you really need to think of where you see yourself and your families in 2050. As we've pointed out, you'll be approaching 50 then. May seem old, having passed it recently. You get creaky, but you sort of survive somehow. So if we've survived all the global pandemics, you'll be in 2050 sort of in the midpoint in your career. You'll probably have families. Perhaps you'll have genetically modified grandchildren. That's yet to be proven. But nevertheless, you'll be in a different place. So you have to think of where you will be, because I think that will help you answer this question of whether you'll be able to migrate more easily or with greater difficulty in 2050. Why do I say that? Well, I think over the next 40 years, national governments will do what they've long tried to do, but they'll be better able to do it. And that's to distinguish between migrants or potential migrants that they want and potential migrants that they don't want. And I'll give you a tangible example from today. For those of you that travel on a United States passport, if you show up at a European airport, you will have the easiest time entering Europe. Often just flashing the passport is enough. You'll be there for a few seconds. They won't pay much attention to you. If you're a European, however, from one of those same countries that wants to enter the US, your country has negotiated on your behalf. They have set up an arrangement with the United States where their nationals can enter the United States without barrier. Well, we define without barrier as you have to fill out an online form in advance. You have to be approved in advance to enter, not something that we have to do going the other direction. You have to provide biometrics, fancy word for fingerprints and photographs, at the point of entry. And you have to subject yourself to an interview. Nominally, we're peers. Western Europe, us, elites in both countries, carrying the passports of those countries. Even now, we set up a big difference. Imagine how much more complicated it is for somebody from the developing world trying to enter the United States. Many of you probably have family members who've had to go through that, get months of approval in advance, provide all kinds of financial records to show that you'll emigrate. Countries have long wanted to do this. We've gotten to the point where we can do it relatively well. By 2050, I suspect all of these technologies will be even more dramatic. So we will be able to distinguish between, if you'll excuse the terminology, good migrants and bad migrants. Countries will also continue to recognize the need for international migrants, for international labor. That's why so many people are in flux today in terms of living in a country other than the one where they were born. But we will increasingly, with the implementation of technologies, have the ability to give some migrants the opportunity to remain permanently and to become part of the host society. Think permanent resident immigrants in today's United States. But we'll have an even larger category of people who will be allowed to enter for short periods of time to do a specific labor or to provide a specific sort of service, and then will be asked to leave. And countries have long tried to do this. Often they've failed, if you think to the United States Bracero program as an example. But again, with technology, we'll be in a better position to actually force people to leave at the end of their service, at the end of their labor in the country. And if those of you that have looked at the new immigration reform bill that's being debated in the United States Senate right now, you've probably looked at the part that's gotten all the media attention that talks about legalization, a path to permanent residence. Sometimes they refer to it as a path to citizenship. But buried in there, not buried in there, it's actually most of the pages, talks about all kinds of new guest worker programs, new opportunities for people to come to the United States, provide their labor, and then thankfully leave at the end of that service. And interestingly, we're not just asking people, as we have in the past at the lower end of the economy, people to do agricultural labor, people to clean our hotel rooms, to come in on a short-term basis. We're also asking more and more people at the high end of the economy, those with technical skills, those with college degrees and even advanced degrees who work in the technology sector, to come for brief periods and then to move on, to return to their countries of origin. Countries have long wanted to disassociate, nations have long wanted to disassociate the labor that they get from immigrants from the commitment that they have traditionally had to make to immigrants to integrate them into society. And I would suggest that with technologies that are newly emerging and our willingness to deploy those technologies, we will see a greater disassociation between the ability to migrate, which is to visit for a while, maybe to work for a while, and the ability to settle, which is the way we've traditionally treated immigration in the United States and really through much of the developed world. A final change that I think we'll see by 2050, and one that can only be answered in terms of sort of where you see yourself in 2050, is that citizenship, formal membership in a country's politics, will increasingly be used tactically by countries. And I think we're seeing this already to some degree today. If you'd like to immigrate to the United States and you can invest $500,000 and employ 10 people for a certain amount of time, we're more than happy to have you. There's a visa program for you, and that's why many hotels in South Texas are owned by people of Indian extraction. They see a good opportunity, they invest $500,000, they employ 10 people, and they get visas. You think $500,000 may or may not be worth immigration? Well, it's being lowered now. Spain recently announced a program where if you bought property worth $200,000, you could get residency in Spain. Why is that? Well, they have a glut of property, and they figure they can get rid of some of that glut and with the trivial opportunity of extending nationality in Spain. So anyway, countries are using the opportunity to settle, to become a permanent member of that society more tactically. And I think by 2050, we will see a great deal more of that. So we're entering a world where more people will be in motion. I think we can be relatively confident of that. More people will be welcomed for short periods of time if they have a skill, if they have an interest, if they have something that is desired by the place they'd like to migrate to. We have the opportunity for some, but I'd argue probably a fewer number, to become citizens of the country to which they might migrate. So the real answer to this question, I think, for 2050, when you're all roughly 50 years old, is you'll be able to migrate if you have a set of skills, interests, and resources, money resources, educational resources, skills that are unique, that are desired somewhere else. If you're not in that position, you might not so easily be able to choose to pick up and move. And why would that be an issue? Well, you might have a family member somewhere else. You might have friends that you'd like to join. You might have what would in 2050 be considered some sort of an untraditional relationship that you'd like to continue with. So, the freedom that we've long assumed as residents of the United States, as citizens of the United States, that we have the ability to go wherever and do whatever, may slowly change. I think for people coming into the United States, those opportunities will change even more rapidly, and we will probably, by 2050, become less a nation of migration. Does that matter? Well, it matters if you have relatives abroad that you might like to see in the United States in 2050. So on that rather dour note, I will echo my colleagues' somewhat pessimistic views for 2050, but I'll also remind you that we can influence our political process. So to the degree that you care about legalization, the opportunity for unauthorized kids to become part of the United States, to the extent that you care about immigration policy for the next generation, for your generation, I'd encourage you to pay attention to what's going on in Congress now and to express your views. My personal bias is that the bill will not pass, but I think a groundswell of support from particularly young people who tend to live in Republican-represented districts in South Orange County can have a lot of influence on the outcome of that bill. So thank you very much.
Now, last but certainly not least, I would like to introduce Andrew Duncan, one of the brightest and most talented graduate students of sociology, who has consistently and generously lent a hand to developing curriculum for Global Connect. Andrew's passion for teaching was exemplified by his willingness to present on topics outside of his field of study, such as the European Union, and he's even spending an entire year in China to enhance his already extensive knowledge on the country. In fact, his expertise has made him an invaluable source on China, and today he'll share his thoughts on whether or not China has what it takes to be a superpower by 2050. Please help me in welcoming Andrew Duncan.
Although I do look forward to seeing the video.
All right, there we go.
All right, hi, thank you. Well, I say, of course, it is always a pleasure to see you. I say that every time, and I mean it every time. And in this case, it's particularly a pleasure. I have to echo what all of the prior distinguished scholars have said. I'm not one of them, but There's a lot of concern about the future. There really is. The very real resource limitations, very real and increasing inequality, these are things that we absolutely have to be concerned with. But I'm choosing to make today an optimistic discussion, and I'll use China as a case study, but it's going on the assumption that by 2050 there will still be a China, and there will still be a global economy for China to participate in. So it's not to say that all of those aren't real concerns, just that seeing all of you and the types of interactions we have in programs like this, it makes me optimistic for the future. So I want to talk about China as this case study, but I want to say that it's important. I say that China will be successful, whether it's a superpower or not, it's just a title. They will be a successful, developed, advanced economy, advanced country, and that'll be a good thing for the whole world. Not just for micro-level solutions, not just for the case of China or individuals in China, but also China as a challenge to a standard development model. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. China as an alternative to a Western development model, because they have been successful and they will continue to be successful, kind of despite the opportunity, the development trap, and I'll discuss all of this in a minute. China is connected with other countries, other developing countries, through the BRIC nations, through initiatives that they've pursued that you've been reading about during this quarter. And again, that poses an alternate to what some would call a Western imperialism. So China is something that I kind of want to see succeed, in a friendly way, of course. So what challenges exist? When I saw you last, I discussed, is China a superpower at present? And I think we said no, but they're moving there. And so in the context of will they be, and I think they will be a superpower by 2050, what challenges do they have? And there are two ones, one of which we already heard about. In China, there's a lot of inequality. There's the rural and urban divide, where there are very rich individuals, still a small minority of the population, and there's a huge, huge number of people, hundreds of millions of people that live in relative poverty or even still in extreme poverty. And the second challenge that they face is declining exports. If you read newspapers about the Chinese economy today, one of the big things that you're going to see is, how can the Chinese economy continue to succeed in the face of declining exports? We're buying fewer things from them, maybe because our own economy has suffered somewhat. And if we're buying fewer things from them, there's not much left. Their economy is dependent upon selling goods to either the European Union or the United States. A couple other countries too, of course, but by and large, that is the situation. There are solutions to both of these, though. I think that it could work out very nicely to China, for China. One part of it, in terms of getting rid of massive inequality, is to address, they have laws in place, they call them hukou laws, which are registration for where you're allowed to live, where you're allowed to gain benefits, where you're allowed to work, legally at least. Changing these sorts of things, changing these laws, can be one step in addressing the rural and urban divide. Growing a domestic consumer base, a middle class, just like what we want to have here, just like what we think we have here, China needs to have that. China needs to have more of that as well. And so phasing out the hukou registration system will allow more people to eventually become middle class. And so why am I optimistic about China's capacity to actually overcome these challenges? Well, because they're things that the government can do. And over the last 30 years, the Chinese government has been pretty effective at setting a target, setting a goal, and achieving it. They don't always use the best means. They don't always achieve it in the most efficient straight line possible, but they have been very effective. So if there are policy solutions, if there are structural solutions to these problems, and the Chinese government chooses to pursue those, I think that they can be very effective. So these challenges are not impossible if they are met with a plan. But there are two problems in this little case study of development. China is in the same developmental trap that many other nations have experienced over the past 50 years. part of the vast international development program of trying to spread wealth, arguably spread wealth, from Western countries like the United States to all of the poorer developing nations in the world is to industrialize. But what happens when they get these industries, when they build these industries? Maybe they even get factories from the United States, and they're taking workers from us, and it is very much related to the decline of our middle class. But does it really create a middle class in most of these countries? And the answer is no. Because, again, these countries are entirely dependent upon exports. So what can they do if they want to create a middle class? If your economy is dependent upon cheap labor, can you pay your laborers more? Can you raise the currency value so you can create an independent middle class that can actually consume in a way, similar to what we expect? No, you can't. So these countries wind up being trapped. So we only buy from these countries if it's cheap, and as soon as they do these things, if they do choose to pursue creating a middle class, we call it capital flight. The money, the jobs, the industry goes elsewhere. Mexico is a case study of this as well. Before China, in the 90s, after the passage of NAFTA, many of the things that we buy were produced in Mexico. Then eventually it passed along from one country to another as this development issue progressed, and that's how it ended up in China as the world's workshop. China, though, has an advantage, in my opinion, in their enormous population. 1.3 billion people, so that it can steadily grow a middle class that has the income to consume in the same way that we do here. And for every person that moves out of that low-wage sector to become middle class, maybe it's a service sector, presumably they've solved the inequality issue, so service sector jobs might actually pay well. Someone from the rural poor, now living in extreme poverty, can move in to take that position in the factory. And I think that's a very powerful thing for them, something that most other countries didn't have the capacity to do because most of their workforces were already employed. China hasn't met that, or hasn't reached that limit yet. So this may sound slow. It sounds kind of depressing. Oh, we'll just say some people can be middle class and then the really, really poor people can be a little less poor. I understand. That does sound like kind of a negative thing, but it's still progress, right? It's still the alleviation of extreme poverty. It's still a creation of a middle class. And the creation of the middle class has to be slow for the second major problem with this, and it relates to what we've talked about before, ecological concerns. If China just added hundreds of millions of new people tomorrow, there's already several hundred million people who we can consider to be consumers, middle class. If they just added several hundred million more, that's more people than our entire population. Well, do we have the resources for that? Of course, we don't. The answer is that we don't. Hopefully, maybe one day we can have the resources for that, whether it's through some limitation of our own consumption patterns or through some technological solution that brings us all out of the great immiseration that's coming. But again, here I have some faith in China to address these ecological problems that face them because, well, to be honest, if anybody's been to Beijing, you can see, you can taste, and you can smell the ecological problems happening right in front of them. It's not just the depletion of resources, it's the pollution of the entire environment, and it's actually unpleasant. I'll tell you, going on a jog for just even a half a mile or going and playing basketball on a court outside in Beijing, I was falling to the ground choking. It was incredible, the amount of pollution there. And it's become a national issue that the state does have a perspective on. Now, again, you could call into question whether you believe that the state will be effective or if they really will say that this is in their interest, but I'm taking the optimistic perspective here and saying that, again, they will have a solution proposed. They will work with the international community, because of course environment is not just a national problem. and they will try to solve these problems. In fact, I think it's in their economic interest too. So this ties back to the creation of greater economic development that they're trying to do. They want to try to increase their economic standing to not just be the workplace of the world, but to actually be a direct contributor to the creation of new ideas, to innovating new projects, new products. And one of the big ways that they choose to do that is through green energy, green technology, and alternative fuel sources, excuse me. They're one of the lead producers in solar panels and solar technology, and if they can continue that trajectory, they might wind up being the leader of a new era of post-fossil fuel energy consumption. Again, maybe it's a little bit optimistic, but I think that this could be a very real outcome of this. So how does this affect you over your lives? If I'm wrong, and China does not overcome these problems by 2050, then the environmental degradation from all the coal and oil consumption there will continue. The inequality existing there will continue, and the problems will continue exactly as we've discussed previously. If I'm right in my expectations above, then China might well be at the center of the world economy in a way that they're not right now. We know they're important, but they're not at the center of the economy like we are, like Western Europe. And that will come with political and cultural impacts that will be direct upon your lives. You might be buying energy from Chinese-owned solar power companies instead of from Royal Dutch Shell, British Petroleum, or any American oil company of the numerous ones of them. You might be working for a Chinese-owned company, whether that's because Chinese companies have actually built up name brands for themselves. The TVs that you buy that have names from some other company, well, they're produced in China. They're produced by a company in China that could one day start marketing TVs themselves. Maybe you work for them. Maybe you work for the variety of other Chinese companies. Or maybe you work for a company that was bought by China. China has increasingly spread out their money into the international economy, buying portions of other companies, even just very recently, buying major American companies. And then finally, you might be listening to Chinese pop music or watching Chinese movies, because as they become more important, centrally located within the global economy, they'll begin to export their culture as well, just in the same way that we do. So could there be a Chinese Hollywood or something similar? Of course. And I want to end with, all of these are good things. This is the positive side of globalization that I'm presenting to you, where globalization brings people together and it offers new opportunities to all of us, hopefully, as we address these issues of inequality. So, thank you.
All right, so could we please thank our professors, Professor Danziger, Professor DeCipio, future Professor Andrew Duncan, and Professor Gilmore for spending their times in your classrooms and for coming to Symposium today to share with you their global expectations. So another round of applause, please.